1st and 2nd Kings is home to some of the coolest stories in the entire Bible. Elijah calling down fire from heaven to light a sacrifice for God. Calling down fire from heaven to smite entire companies of soldiers. Boy, there was a lot of fire from heaven flying around back then. But none of that would have occurred without the person who is our topic of the day, Jezebel. Her story shows us the power of influence. She was a queen of Israel, and while that role comes with a lot of luxury, it doesn't come with a lot of authority. But Jezebel finds a way to still become a powerful and feared person within Israel because she's leveraging her influence over those who are in authority around her. This is actually really similar to Esther, who we talked about in a recent video. However, she usually uses her influence for good, while Jezebel always uses her influence for evil, and that eventually leads to her brutal death. We first meet Jezebel when she marries King Ahab, the 7th king of Israel from after the split with Judah. Now, it's not like Ahab was just a completely normal king until he married Jezebel, as we're told before he marries her that he did evil in the Lord's sight even more than any of the kings before him. And that's saying something, because the kings of evil were mostly pretty darn evil. So marrying Jezebel just accelerated him on the course that he was already on. Jezebel was the daughter of the king of Sidon, a nation that descended from the firstborn son of Canaan himself. That means that this was one of the nations that Israel was instructed by God to wipe out as his judgment upon them for centuries of egregious sins. Men like Joshua and David worked incredibly hard to accomplish this task, but didn't quite complete it. And now we see 100 years later, King Ahab is getting into bed with the same evil that his predecessors worked to destroy. The first time we see Jezebel in action, she's trying to kill off Elijah, the chief prophet of the God of Israel. And she's doing this because he had just proven that the God of Israel has authority over the gods that she worships, Baal and Asherah. He did this by challenging all the prophets of Baal and Asherah to a contest. He said, let's build an altar, put a sacrifice on it, but not light the wood. Instead, we'll each pray to our God and ask them to light the fire for us. The prophets of Baal and Asherah went first, but after hours and hours of praying to their gods and having absolutely nothing happen, they gave up. Elijah steps up and says, this isn't even challenging enough for me. Put water on the altar, and more water, and more water. Then when Elijah prays, fire comes down from heaven and lights up the altar. It even eats up the rocks that the altar was built on. This is actually a pretty famous story in the Bible, but it's oftentimes illustrated with the prophets of Baal and Asherah being represented by 3, maybe 10 prophets, and then a few onlookers. The reality of this story is that Jezebel had employed 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. That means that there were 850 men praying in unison for their gods to light this altar, and nothing happened. And when Elijah prayed all by himself, fire from heaven came down and consumed the entire sacrifice, wood, altar, and the water. After this incredible show of God's power, the people of Israel fall down and worship God, and Elijah tells them, capture all the prophets of Baal and Asherah, that we can put them to death. And it seems that there was enough people of Israel present that there was no problem capturing every single one of the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah and putting them to death. So Jezebel takes this as a huge slap in the face. The prophet of God just proved that his God is more powerful than my gods, and he went and killed all the prophets that I've been employing. So Jezebel's ticked off, all her hard work practically undone in one night. So she makes it a top priority for herself and her husband to hunt down and kill Elijah. Upon hearing this, Elijah is terrified and he actually runs away and hides. God has to come confront Elijah and say, hey, relax, it's a god versus a queen, you have nothing to worry about. God then instructs Elijah to anoint 3 people, a new king of Aram, which is a neighboring nation, a new king of Israel, and the next prophet that will succeed Elijah. Elijah immediately goes and finds the person that God said will succeed him as the prophet of Israel. This guy's name is Elisha. Yes, it's confusing. Elijah is succeeded by Elisha. Okay. However, Elijah never gets around to anointing the 2 kings that God told him to anoint. Why not? Well, I would assume it's because when you're anointing a new king over a nation, you're anointing somebody outside of the family of the king. And that's treason. Elijah's life is already at risk. The king and queen of Israel already hate him. How much more so does an enemy nation hate him? And he's supposed to go to both places and anoint a successor and commit treason. So Elijah just doesn't do it, and it ends up falling to his successor, Elisha. When we cut back to King Ahab, we see that he's trying to buy a vineyard that's conveniently right next to his palace from its current owner. And this guy's name is Naboth. He offers to pay what it's worth or even replace it with an even more expensive vineyard somewhere else. But to many of the people in Israel, the land that their ancestors were given over 100 years ago is more valuable than anything else. So Naboth says, I can't sell you the land that belonged to my ancestors. And that sends Ahab home in a fit of depression. He goes to bed, faces the wall, and refuses to get up. Jezebel eventually goes to find out what's bothering him so much, and when she finds out, she says, "Are you the king of Israel or not? Get up and eat something. Don't worry about it. I'll get you Naboth's vineyard." She proceeds to write a letter to the elders of Jezreel, the town where Naboth lived. She instructed them to hold an event and to place Naboth in a place of honor, and then to find two scoundrels, two men that didn't mind lying, to come and accuse him of cursing God and the king. The law in Israel required that you have two witnesses with the same account in order to punish somebody for a crime, and the punishment for this crime was death. So the people of Jezreel took Naboth outside and stoned him to death. Jezebel goes to King Ahab with pride to tell him, Naboth is dead, you can now claim his vineyard. So Ahab goes to Jezreel in order to claim the vineyard that he wanted all along, with no questions and much happiness. However, when he gets there, he's faced with his least favorite person, Elijah. And Elijah says to him, I have come because you have sold yourself to what is evil in the Lord's sight. So now the Lord says, I will bring disaster on you and consume you. I will destroy every one of your male descendants, slave and free alike, anywhere in Israel. For you have made me very angry and have led Israel into sin. And regarding Jezebel, the Lord says, dogs will eat Jezebel's body at the plot of land in Jezreel. The members of Ahab's family who die in the city will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the field will be eaten by vultures. This is the most brutal judgment on any of the kings in Israel. Not only is he going to die, his whole entire family is going to die, and none of them are going to get burials. They'll be eaten by dogs and vultures. When Ahab first saw that Elijah had showed up at Jezreel, he had kind of a snotty response to seeing him. But after hearing, hey, this is the last straw in your pattern of evil, and it's going to end your entire line, then he changed his tune. He humbled himself before God by fasting and wearing burlap night and day. Seeing this, God tells Elijah, do you see how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has done this, I will not do what I promised during his lifetime. It will happen to his sons. I will destroy his dynasty. It's amazing to me to see that even in the face of such blatant evil, God still has mercy on anyone who will humble themselves before him. And this wasn't the first time that God showed favor towards King Ahab despite his incredible wickedness. King Ben-Hadad had threatened to come in with a much larger force and wipe out the kingdom of Israel. In this battle, Ahab actually listens to the prophet of God and conducts the battle the way that he tells him to, and through that, he has victory over a significantly stronger force. But 3 years later, he wants to go to war with Ben-Hadad again, and he even loops Judah into it. But when the prophet says, hey, you shouldn't do this, he goes and does it anyways, getting himself and the king of Judah killed. Fantastic. So Ahab's son Ahaziah takes the throne, and Jezebel goes from being queen to being queen mother, perhaps an even more powerful position as far as influence goes. However, Ahaziah worships Baal instead of God, so after only 2 years of being king, he falls through some lattice work in an upper level of his palace, and he's bedridden. Then he sends messengers to Ekron, one of the Philistines' capital cities, to ask the prophets of Baal-zebub if he will survive. Small tangent, the Pharisees will later accuse Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Baal-zebub, who they knew as the Prince of Demons. However, when they're on their way to Ekron, they get interrupted by Elijah himself, who asks them, is there no God in Israel? Why are you going to Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to ask whether the king will recover? Now, therefore, this is what the Lord says. You will never leave the bed you're lying on. You will surely die. When the messengers come back way too early, Ahaziah asks, who stopped you? And because they described him as hairy and having a leather belt, he knows immediately that it's Elijah. Now, Ahaziah has likely learned from his parents to hate Elijah, so he sends a company of 50 soldiers to go arrest Elijah. And when they go up to the hill to arrest Elijah, the captain says, man of God, the king has commanded you to come down with us. But Elijah replies to the captain, if I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and destroy you and your 50 men. Then fire does come from heaven and wipes out the entire company. So Ahaziah sends another 50 men, and the captain says to Elijah, man of God, the king demands that you come down at once. And Elijah replies again, if I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and destroy you and your 50 men. And again, fire rains down from heaven and wipes them off the face of the earth. And Ahaziah, in his infinite wisdom, sends another 50 men. However, this captain is much wiser, and he falls on his knees before Elijah. And he says, "O man of God, please spare my life and the lives of these your 50 servants. See how the fire from heaven came down and destroyed the first 2 groups. Now please spare my life." A position of submission and surrender from this captain and his 50 men. God gives Elijah the green light to go with these men. He goes to the king, he gives them the exact same message, and within the year, the king is dead. Since he had no son to take his place, his brother Joram takes over. Soon after, Elijah is taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, leaving a ton of work to his successor, Elisha. And while Elisha does a ton of really cool things, I'm going to stick in this video to just the things that he does that are influenced by Jezebel. So we're going to skip right to the anointing of the 2 kings that Elijah didn't end up doing. Elisha first goes to Damascus, the capital city of Aram, where he anoints the successor of King Ben-Hadad. Now that was a scary thing to do, because if Ben-Hadad had found out, Elisha might have died. But when it comes to anointing the king of the nation that he lives in, that's even more terrifying. So Elisha actually gets another prophet, a younger prophet, and tells him to go do it for him. Elisha gets this younger prophet, tells him to get a flask of oil, go find Jehu, get him in a private room, anoint him quickly, and then get out. Run for your life. This is because Jehu is a commander over the army of Israel. He's always armed, and it's his duty to kill anyone who commits treason against the king, which is exactly what Elijah's asking this young prophet to do. The young prophet enters a room where Jehu is sitting around a table with a bunch of the other commanders, and he says, "I have a message for you, commander." And Jehu says, "Which one of us?" And he says, "For you, commander." So Jehu goes with him into a house nearby where the young prophet anoints him with oil and says this prophecy. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anoint you king over the Lord's people, Israel. You are to destroy the family of Ahab, your master. In this way, I will avenge the murder of my prophets and all the Lord's servants who were killed by Jezebel. The entire family of Ahab must be wiped out. I will destroy every one of his male descendants, slave and free alike, anywhere in Israel. Dogs will eat Ahab's wife Jezebel at the plot of land in Jezreel, and no one will bury her." Then he opens the door and bolts. Jehu goes back to sit with his fellow officers, and they ask him, "Hey, what did the crazy guy want? Is everything all right?" And Jehu says, "You know guys like that, how they just kind of tend to babble on." But his fellow officers say, "You're hiding something. Tell us what happened." Now keep in mind that Jehu had just been anointed with olive oil, so that might have played a factor in them knowing that he was hiding something from them. "What's up, Jehu? What'd the crazy guy want?" "Oh, you know guys like that, they just like to yap and whatnot. Something tells me you're lying." "What gave me away?" It's likely that Jehu didn't know how his fellow officers would respond, especially if he acted excited about this news. Especially if he acted like, this is a prophecy and it's gonna come true and I have to follow it. So he had to at least feign like he thought that the man was crazy and he didn't believe what they were saying, so that he would have plausible deniability if they didn't agree with it. So now Jehu can tell them, "He said to me, 'This is what the Lord says, I have anointed you to be king over Israel.'" And in response, his fellow commanders immediately got up, took off their cloaks, and laid them down across the stairs for Jehu to walk on top of. They blew ram's horns and they proclaimed, "Jehu is king in Israel." And that's all the support Jehu needed. He flies into action, telling his men, "Lock down this town, make sure nobody leaves, because we can't have the king hearing that I'm about to run a coup." As they approach Jezreel, the watchman in the tower shouts down to the king, "Hey, there's a company of men approaching." So King Joram says, "Send out a rider to find out if they're coming in peace." These guys were so far away, they couldn't even tell who it was. So the horseman rides out and says to Jehu, "The king wants to know if you're coming in peace." Now I imagine Jehu didn't stop to have any conversations with these riders. I imagine he's still gunning it forward in his chariot, and the rider is keeping pace beside him, and they're shouting this conversation back and forth. So Jehu shouts back, "What do you know about peace? Fall in." Now the watchman on the tower at Jezreel shouts down to the king, "Hey, he just fell in with the company that's approaching us. He's not coming back." So Joram says, "Send out another rider." And another rider goes out and rides up next to Jehu and says, "Hey, the king wants to know if you come in peace." And Jehu tells him, "What do you know about peace? Fall in." So the guy at the watchtower says, "That guy's not returning either. He also just joined up with the riders." But you know what? It's gotta be Jehu, because he's driving like a madman. So King Joram says, "Enough of this, get me my chariot," and he mounts up and rides out to meet Jehu. Now this time I imagine they do stop to talk to each other. Joram rides up, stops his chariot and says, "Do you come in peace, Jehu?" And Jehu replies, "How can there be peace as long as the idolatry and witchcraft of your mother Jezebel are all around us?" Joram immediately turns his chariot around and flees back towards Jezreel, shouting to the king of Judah who was sitting there, "It's treason!" But Jehu pulls his bow and launches an arrow towards his moving target, piercing King Joram right between the shoulders, straight through the heart. He slumps into his chariot and dies. Jehu also tells his men to go kill the king of Judah, who had allied himself with King Joram. Now, as Jezebel hears that Jehu has come to take Jezreel, she dolls herself up, does her makeup really nicely, and sits in a window in the tower. When Jehu approaches, she shouts down to him, "Have you come in peace, you murderer? You're just like Zimri, who murdered his master." Now, she's hurling a massive insult at Jehu here. Zimri was also an officer in Israel some time back who had also killed a king and replaced him, but he only ruled for 2 weeks before he was also killed and replaced. She's pronouncing over Jehu, "You're just as much of an idiot as that guy, and your reign is likely to be just as short-lived." Jehu looked up at the window and shouted, "Who's on my side?" 2 or 3 eunuchs peeked their head out the window. These eunuchs would have been men that spent their entire life serving Jezebel. That was the people that serviced the queen, were men who were unable to do anything sexually with her. Jehu yells up to these eunuchs, "Throw her down!" And these men who knew her for several years betray her, shoving her out the window. She falls to the ground, and Jehu and his men trample her to death with their horses' hooves as they enter the city. Jehu enters the palace, and he celebrates by drinking with his men. But after a minute, he feels bad, and he says, "You know what? That is the daughter of a king. We should treat her body with some respect. Go and bury her." But the men who went to find her body only found her hands and feet. The rest had been consumed by dogs. And Jehu, upon hearing this, says, "Well, that fulfills the prophecy." And that's the story of Jezebel, a woman who was highly influential through 3 separate kings, who did as much as she could to lead Israel further astray than it already was, and the punishment that became her and her family because of her evil. She's said to be the most evil woman who's ever lived, and she died as such. I want more movies about this stuff. Scenes like oil dripping down Jehu's face and him driving a chariot like a maniac, shouting conversations back and forth to messengers. It deserves to be put to film. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more like it, be sure and subscribe.